Good afternoon. My name is Charles White. I'm Director of Projects in Civic Engagement in the School of Education at Boston University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conference titled History and Civic Education, the Learning of Liberty for Civic Life, co-sponsored by the Pioneer Institute. Projects in Civic Engagement consists of 4 programs whose aim is to foster civic engagement among children and youth, both in the United States and overseas. The programs include We the People, the Citizen and the Constitution, We the People, Project Citizen, Civitas, an international civic education exchange, and Civics Mosaic. The first 3 of these are administered by the Center for Civic Education in Calabasas, California, with funding from the U.S. Department of Education by an act of Congress. Civics Mosaic is administered by the Council for Citizenship Education at Russell Sage College, also funded by the U.S. Department of Education. The School of Education is home for these projects in Massachusetts, including the Civitas partnership with Russia and the Civics Mosaic partnership with Bulgaria. Included in your packet is information about these projects, as well as a reference to our website, www.bu.edu/education/civic engagement. You will hear more about these projects a little bit later. Much has been written in the press and in research reports about what former President of Tufts, John DiBiagio, referred to as America's sagging spirit, and what Harvard's Robert Putnam captured in the image of bowling alone. However, since 2001, many have seen an encouraging positive trend in civic engagement. But how do we sustain it? How do we reproduce civic engagement across time and generations? Consider the following quote from a book called Democratic Education by University of Pennsylvania president and political scientist Amy Gutmann. Political education, the cultivation of the virtues, knowledge, and skills necessary for political participation, has moral primacy over other purposes of public education in a democratic society. Political education prepares citizens to participate in consciously reproducing their society. And conscious reproduction is the ideal not only of democratic education, but also of democratic politics. The most devastating criticism we can level at primary schools, therefore, is not that they fail to give equally talented children an equal chance to earn the same income or to pursue professional occupations, but that they fail to give all children an education adequate to take advantage of their political status as citizens. That's a provocative claim, and one I think worthy of some reflection. But how does one learn to be a citizen in a democracy? What is required in the learning of liberty? I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to hear one of America's preeminent scholars of the founding period to share his insights about this question and the fundamental principles that guide or should guide our efforts to promote civic engagement in a democracy. So welcome on behalf of Boston University School of Education. I'd like to turn now to Jim Sturgis, Executive Director of the Pioneer Institute, to add his words of welcome. Jim?
Thank you, Charles. Appreciate that. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm Jim Sturgis, Executive Director of Pioneer Institute. I want to welcome all of you. I want to thank Charles for the co-sponsorship of this event and also for all the work that you do in advancing an understanding of civics and the founders among our teachers. Pioneer has a vigorous interest in all of education reform, K through 12 mainly. We are interested in improving the access that children have to the liberal arts, essentially. That, in a nutshell, is what we're about, because only mastery of that subject will allow folks to actually understand the importance of history, of citizenship, and, frankly, even of our identity. We're looking forward to Dr. Wood's remarks. He brings a rare depth and authority to the topic, as Charles had alluded to. I want to make just a couple of brief remarks before inviting Council President Feeney to come to the podium. I know that these days American exceptionalism is frowned upon by many, and I would make the argument, however, that we are different. Unlike our European ancestors and unlike the waves of immigrants, of which I am a child, we are Americans because we emerge from an idea, a set of ideas. And you could say that in a way, I guess I say this because I'm Greek, we're a little like little Zeuses born from the Titans, but the Titans in this case aren't Cronus or Rhea, the titans of the founders, and we are emanations from them in many respects. Being an idea is, yes, egotistical. It's wonderful, it's exciting, and it also brings many, many challenges. Small things like overemphasis on innocence, easy disregard of history, maybe discarding history, doesn't matter because the idea that you have in front of you is so important. And I'd say, without putting judgment on this, whether positive or negative, that as an idea, when we put ourselves in the realm of other ideas as we see the world internationally, we often are highly motivated by the moral trappings of our ideas, perhaps even more so than self-interest. What all that means, I think, is that the founders play an enormously important role in how we think about today. We are, in a sense, a fruit of their labor, whether it's economically, legally, politically, scientifically, or otherwise. We've seen this every time there is a huge period of change or tumult in our nation's history. We've seen it at times when we had the Civil War in Lincoln, World War II with Churchill, and I mean that with Churchill, and the Civil Rights Movement with MLK. All of these folks went back and harnessed a language that belonged to the founders, and they revamped it, reshaped it for a new generation. Thus, learning in the classics, in science and history and literature, just as the founders had done and seen as their way of achieving social mobility, is as important now as it was in the age of the Enlightenment. Another point to make is, and this is a little bit simple-minded, I suppose, hard work. Folks take a look at those geniuses. We look at them and say they're geniuses of that time. And we look at folks like Alexander Hamilton, we say, wow, what a smart guy. And certainly he was. But frankly, beyond all that was his hard work. That is someone who believed, I am not of the status to be in leadership, but I will get there no matter what stands in front of me. And it was an enormous amount of hard work. If you take a look back at the period of 1788, and the drafting of the Federalist Papers, these were essentially first drafts. And times he was actually writing 3,000-word drafts a week. And they stand on their own, unedited to this day. There was a lot of work that brought him to the point where he could actually do that. And that wasn't his day job. During his day job, he was creating a U.S. banking system and creating a finance system for the country. He said of himself, men give me credit for some genius. All the genius I have is this. When I have a subject in mind, I study it profoundly. Day and night it is before me. My mind becomes pervaded with it. The effort which I have made is what people are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It is the fruit of labor and thought. Those are the two things they've given us, an idea, thought, and labor. I'd like to think that Pioneer is very inspired by the example of Hamilton. I guess I would say that more than our brains, we rely on our diligence and our hard work. We know the importance of engaging people in a battle of ideas, and we do. On the importance of public education, the role of parental choice and responsibility, and the need for accountability in our schools as we create the next generation of citizens. Now, that is my yapping at you. I'd like to invite Maureen Feeney to come up and say a few words. I would say just a couple of things about Maureen as she comes up. She was elected to the Boston City Council in 1993, and she represents Dorchester's District 3. Over 14 years, she has acquired what everyone knows is a very strong commitment to her constituents. In 2007, she was unanimously elected to the City Council as president, and she was unanimously re-elected in 2008. She has certainly earned her stripes. Many of you know her for her work in terms of trying to get people civically engaged in their communities. We look forward to working with her as she does so. Maureen, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Jim. It is truly my privilege to be here this afternoon and to thank you, to recognize two outstanding institutions in the city of Boston, the Pioneer Institute and Boston University. People who are always pushing the envelope, who are always challenging not just our minds, but our spirits and our will to move forward. And that is always exciting to participate at any level. I wish I could stay here throughout the whole event and hear all of the speakers, and especially Professor Wood. I look so forward to his comments. To tell you a little bit, last Saturday, we had the first ever Boston Civic Summit. And this Civic Summit, unlike other events that may have occurred, which were focused on topics or areas of concern, our summit was focused on the revitalization of civic engagement. I have the privilege of having been born into a family. I was one of 7 children and had the privilege of growing up with parents who recognized that they weren't just creating a family for us, but instilled in us, not just through word, but through example, the sheer privilege we had of living, being born, being raised in Boston, the very cradle of history, that we should take advantage of all that's around us. Don't just think about, oh, I'm just off to school, or, I've got events or sports, but to recognize the wonderful environment that we were born into. And I can tell you that having 2 children, one who's now an attorney and one who's a junior at Boston College, both of them are history fanatics. So my mother's gene has, really followed our generation. But this summit, for me, was truly, it came out of what I have done in my lifetime and where I have been. And through the example of my parents and then getting into public life, it is about public service. It is about seeing a need and trying to address that need, seeing a challenge and trying to find resolution. And to now be in a position of elected office where we can literally direct policy or shape policy for this city, I felt that, we can, at any given point, we could talk about a topic and say, this is really important for us to address this, public safety or education. But the most important element to success, especially when we are talking about the education of our children, is that civic engagement. At the summit, we had the privilege of having Dr. Tom Sander, who is head of the Sagaro Institute at the Kennedy School. And he talked about the difference between bonding, which we do in families and friendships, and bridging. And what we're doing here today is bridging. And the work that gets done through an event or seminar like this is we're each given more tools, something that we can take with us to continue to build those bridges, to connect our vision for education, our desire to instill in future generations those profiles and courage, those individuals who have potential that they can't even see for themselves. Last year, and I don't want to detain you much longer, but last year I had the privilege of going to Bronx Science School in Bronx, New York, obviously. I went there looking with the perspective of, here we are in Boston, really, a city of tremendous educational institutions that are world-renowned, medical institutions, research, and said, this is what we need to be looking at. How can we provide our children with those tools that will allow them to move forward and to change the world? Well, I went to Bronx Science, and I'll tell you, it was an eye-opener to see these young people and their energy and their collaboration with their teachers. They weren't in the classroom, sitting there nodding their head. They were engaged. There was dialogue. The teachers were reaching out to them saying, you have something to share with us. And I believe if we can instill in our youngest children start at the elementary level with civic awareness, giving them the tools to help them to understand how they can accomplish a life that is really rich and fulfilling. Not how much money they're going to make, but how they can look at themselves knowing that they have taken their life and created a better world by what they're doing. So I commend you for what you are doing here today. I look forward to following up with Professor White and hopefully learning more about what you share today. But the task that I have and the pleasure that I have before me today is the privilege of introducing Professor Gordon Wood. Professor Wood is an Alva Oway University professor and professor of history at Brown University. He received his BA degree from Tufts University and his PhD from Harvard University. I guess he's got some pretty good credentials, you might say. He taught at Harvard and at University of Michigan before joining the faculty at Brown in 1969. He's the author of many works, including The Creation of the American Republic, which captures the years from 1776 to 1787, which won the Bancroft Prize and John Dunning Prize in 1970. He also wrote The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History and the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize in 1993. His most recent publication is The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin, which was awarded the Julia Ward Howe Prize for the Boston Authors Club in 2005. He is currently working on a volume in the Oxford History of the United States, dealing with the period of early republic from 1789 to 1815. Professor Wood is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. Something tells me you are going to have an exciting, incredibly wonderful experience this afternoon in listening to someone who can really help us shape our focus so that we can share what we will learn today with our young students, future leaders, but also how we then network and bridge and share this information with our school systems, with our teachers, with our principals, to have them embrace the great opportunity that lies before us. It is with great pleasure that I would like to now introduce Professor Gordon S. Wood.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here, and I wanted to recognize, I was chatting before the ceremonies began with the founder of the Pioneer Institute, and he told me he founded it 20 years ago at the age of 75. So he's sitting right up here. Mr. Peters, is it? Yes. Well, I want to talk about these founders that we are fascinated by. They have a special significance for us, and it's unique to us. We talk about exceptionalism. In this respect, we are exceptional. Celebrating in the way we do these people who created the Constitution or led the revolution, I think is very peculiar. No other major nation honors its past historical characters in the way we do, especially characters who existed 200 years ago. We want to know, and this is the kind of question I often get, maybe you'll ask it of me, what did Thomas Jefferson, what would he think of affirmative action? Or what would George Washington think of our war in Iraq? As far as I know, the British, for example, don't have to check in periodically, say, with either of the two William Pitts to find out how they're doing. This is very unusual for people to do that. we have a special need, I think, for these authentic historical characters in the here and now. And the question we might ask ourselves is, why should this be so? Now, I think scholars have a variety of answers. Some suggest that our continual concern for constitutional jurisprudence and original intent account for our fascination with the founding and the making of the Constitution. Well, that might be true of lawyers and jurists, but it's ordinary people who actually are interested as well. Some think, well, they set a kind of gold standard for politicians, and therefore we have to recover what was wise and valuable in our past. They think these people had something to tell us. That we don't have such leaders today seems to be the question we imply, at least, and we want to know why not. Others, quite sensibly, and this is the one I think really drives this interest, has to do with our American sense of identity. As Jim pointed out earlier, the identities of other nations, by and large, are taken for granted. They're lost in the mists of time and time immemorial, and a Brit knows who he is. He's a Brit, and the French know who the French are. But they're having terrible problems with immigrants. We think we have problems with immigrants. They pale into insignificance compared to the problems the Europeans are facing and will face over the rest of this century as we have this massive demographic invasion from the south. For all the time that the Arabs have been in France, 3 generations, most Frenchmen can't believe that they're really French. And it's the same with the Pakistanis in Britain. They're not really British. They don't look British. We're a different people. We're not a nation in the usual sense of the term. There's no ethnic base, there's no religious base, there's no racial base. A nation made up of so many ethnicities, so many religion and races has to have a different kind of national unity. And we go back to these founders to find out what it is that makes us. It's the institutions, the ideals, the hopes, the aspirations that they set forth that we go back to reaffirm and refresh our identity. I mean, almost everything we believe, equality, liberty, constitutionalism, all of the pursuit of happiness, highest aspirations, our greatest ideals come out of this founding. And our institutions, our governmental institutions. So it's natural that we should go back to look at these founders to find out what kind of people we are. And I think as long as the Republic exists, we'll do that. We'll always go back, periodically. Whenever there's some question, who are we? We'll want to go back to them because they told us it's not an ethnicity, it's a set of ideals. As Jim said, an idea. We are an idea in that sense. Now, they were an incomparable generation. There's no doubt about it, these founders. Despite what Tom Brokaw says, they were the greatest generation, I think. And the succeeding generations of Americans were unable to look back at them, I think, without being overawed by the brilliance of their thought, by the creativity of their politics, and the sheer magnitude of their achievement. They're larger than life. Giants in the earth, a forest of giant oaks is what Lincoln called them. They seem to possess intellectual and political capacities that are well beyond those who followed them. So what were they like? What made them different? Well, first of all, great as they were not demigods or superhuman individuals. They were very much the product of peculiar circumstances and a peculiar moment in time. Nor were they immune to the allures of interests and money that attracted most ordinary human beings. They wanted wealth and position, and often speculated heavily in order to realize their aims. Indeed, several of the most prominent founders, including such as Robert Morris, who was the financier of the Revolution, James Wilson, one of the great minds of the Constitutional Convention, later Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, ended up in debtor's prison. So they're not demigods, but they're not Democrats either, small d. Certainly not Democrats in any modern sense of the term. They were never embarrassed by talk of elitism. They didn't have any of this need to show that they could drink a whiskey with the ordinary folk. And they never hid their sense of superiority to ordinary people. But at the same time, they were never contemptuous of common people. In fact, they always believed that the people in general were the source of their authority. So you had a moment in time where there was a nice balance, I guess you'd say, between aristocratic and democratic values. But even in their own undemocratic time and circumstances, they were unusual, if not unique. As political leaders, they comprised a peculiar sort of elite, a self-created aristocracy, largely based on merit and talent that was unlike the hereditary nobility that ruled 18th century England. Now, 18th century Britain remained under the authority of about 400 families, noble families, whose fabulous scale of landed wealth, their political influence, and aristocratic grandeur was beyond anything that existed here, even among the richest North Americans. While Charles Carroll of Maryland, for example, who was one of the wealthiest planters in the American South, was earning what Americans regarded as the huge sum of 1,800 pounds a year, the Earl of Derby's vast estates were bringing in an annual income of over 40,000 pounds. Think of anybody who's been to England and seen some of these country houses, knows how elaborate that aristocracy was. The Duke of Rockingham's country house in Northumberland, was 650 feet long. I mean, that's longer than 2 football fields. And compare that to, say, Westover, which was the Byrd Mansion, William Byrd's mansion, which you can go visit. It's on the James River, and Byrd was one of the wealthiest Virginians. It's 90 feet long. So 650 versus 90. This is the scale of difference between our so-called aristocracy and the English one from whom we revolted. By English standards, our leaders remained minor gentry at best. And by the English measure of status, lawyers like John Adams and Hamilton were even less distinguished. They were gentlemen, no doubt, but nothing like the English nobility. The American revolutionary elite was thus very different from the English aristocracy. But its very differentness, I think, made them ideally suited to exploit the peculiar character of what historians have come to call the 18th century Enlightenment. Now, the 18th century Anglo-American Enlightenment was preoccupied with politeness, not something that we're generally used to describing the Enlightenment. Now, by politeness, they didn't mean just manners. It has a much broader meaning for them than it does for us. It implied affability, sociability, cultivation. Indeed, politeness was considered to be the source of civility, which was soon replaced by the word civilization. Despite Dr. Johnson, who didn't like civilization, James Boswell, his biographer, said, no, you've got to accept it. Civilization is much better than just civility, and the word, of course, stuck. Civilization implied a social process. Societies, it was assumed, moved through successive stages of historical development. You probably studied these in elementary school. You start with the hunter-gatherer stage, and then you move from there to herding of cattle or livestock. And then you move from there to agriculture. And then the fourth and final stage was a commercial stage, which the European states, Britain, France, and so on, were very much deeply involved in. So you have societies move from a rude state of simplicity and progress to the refined complexity of civilization. And all nations could be located along this spectrum of development, from rudeness to refinement, was a common commencement speech, address, or title. Now, since civilization was something that could be achieved, everything was enlisted in order to push back barbarism and ignorance and spread civility and refinement. All sorts of new organizations and instruments sprung up in the 18th century Anglo-American world to spread light and knowledge among people. Learned societies, lending libraries, debating clubs, assembly rooms, reading groups, gentlemanly magazines, concerts, galleries, museums. So the 18th century is the origins of the world that we're familiar with. This is our world. We have galleries, we have concerts, we have museums. The 18th century English-speaking world created the world that we're familiar with. Culture as a public commodity grows out of this Enlightenment, something that was valuable, that could give status to people, and that could be acquired. That's the crucial thing. The cultural world that we're familiar with, in other words, was a product of this age of enlightenment. Now, at the center of this new civilized world was the idea of a gentleman. Now, defining a proper gentleman was a subject that fascinated the educated public of the 18th century world. And writers from Richard Steele, Addison and Steele, the Coverley Papers. When I was a youngster in high school in Waltham, Massachusetts, not too far away from here, we were assigned the Roger de Coverley Papers. I'm sure my teacher had no idea why they were there from 1910. They were bought by the school system, and so they used them. But actually, what those Roger de Coverley Papers do is teach you how to be a gentleman, teach you civility, politeness, how to be a civilized person. And so you have Richard Steele, but Jane Austen, too. That's what underlies all of her novels, is this proper character of a gentleman. In fact, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are talking about this in their famous correspondence in their retirement, exchanging letters. Who's a proper aristocrat? Who's really a gentleman? How do you define a gentleman? So this is a central aspect of the 18th century Enlightenment. For many in the 18th century, including the American revolutionaries, being a gentleman assumed a moral meaning that was much more important than its social significance. Pure monarchists might still define aristocracies exclusively by the pride of their families, or the size of their estates, or the lavishness of their display, or the arrogance of their bearing. But others increasingly downplayed or ridiculed these characteristics. Think of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Many of you have read the novel, but if you haven't, you've seen the many movies or TV productions of it. Jane Austen was obsessed with defining the proper gentleman. It was not, when Elizabeth Bennet thinks that Mr. Darcy is too arrogant and all stuffed up with his bloodline or his money, she doesn't want anything to do with him. But once she finds out that he's got these other acquired characteristics of learning, of politeness, of civility, then she finds him without the faults that she had assumed. The fact that Lady de Burgh, Mr. Darcy's aunt, is got all this bloodline means nothing to Elizabeth Bennet, who is essentially Jane Austen. She's standing in for Jane Austen's views. All of her novels, or at least most of them, Emma, for example, Mr. Knightley, she's trying to define what is the proper gentleman. And it's not somebody who has a long bloodline or has 10,000 pounds a year, as Mr. Darcy has. That is not what Elizabeth Bennet, alias Jane Austen, thinks makes a real gentleman. So that's what's crucial about this definition. It's not money, and it's not bloodline. It's something else. It's one's politeness, one's civility, one's education, we might say. These are man-made criteria, and that's what they wanted to emphasize. Politeness, grace, taste, learning, character. And it was emphasized so much in the English-speaking world that even the titled aristocrats in England, like Lord Chesterfield, who did have a title, liked to downplay it. He liked to think that his position in the society was due to his talent, not to something he had inherited. That's how strong these views were in the 18th century. To be a gentleman was to think and act like a gentleman, nothing more. It meant being reasonable, tolerant, honest, and virtuous. Now, being a gentleman was the prerequisite to becoming a political leader. It signified being cosmopolitan, standing on elevated ground in order to have a large view of human affairs, and being free of prejudice, parochialism, and the religious enthusiasm of what they called the vulgar and the barbaric. It meant, in short, having all of those characteristics that we today sum up in the idea of a liberal arts education. Indeed, the 18th century created the modern idea of a liberal arts education in the English-speaking world, getting rid of parochialism, getting rid of prejudice. So the age-old distinction between a gentleman and a commoner had a much more vital meaning for them than it does for us today. I mean, we put the term gentleman on our restroom doors. It just simply doesn't carry any of the weight that it did for them, and we've almost totally lost it. But it marked a horizontal cleavage in that that divided that social hierarchy into two unequal parts almost as sharply as the distinction between officers and soldiers divided the army. And indeed, the military division was related to the larger social one. Officers and gentlemen, they went together. Gentlemen who constituted, say, about 5 to 10% of the society, 10% probably in this area in New England, 5% in the South. Those are the people who are set aside from ordinary folk. They were wealthy enough not to have to work, or at least not to have to work with their hands, and they seemed to have a kind of ability to be disinterested in promoting the public good. Now that disinterestedness, think of that word. Disinterested is used now by educated people and educated publications, Washington Post, New York Times, to mean uninterested. You don't care. He's disinterested. He doesn't care about the thing. That's not what they meant. That's a word. What's happened is that we've lost the distinction and we've collapsed it into uninterested, which is what we usually mean by disinterested today. It's too bad when you lose an exclusive meaning to a word, but it probably suggests that we don't believe anybody is disinterested anymore. Because what they meant by disinterested was impartial, the ability to rise above an interest and make an objective judgment. We've lost that, I think probably because we don't believe anybody is capable of rising above an interest. I think there are only two occupations left in the country where we even count on a person being disinterested, truly disinterested. Can you think of what these occupations might be? Judge? Yeah, I think judges, we hope, are disinterested, although I think the fights we're having over confirmation hearings in the Senate suggest that we no longer have confidence even in judges. But there's one other group, other occupation, that we still, I think, have the utmost confidence, I hope, otherwise the whole world will change, being truly disinterested. Umpires, right. Sports umpires and referees. I mean, think of it. I mean, if they, a kid's raised in Boston and he becomes an umpire and then he's umpiring a major league game, Yankees versus the Red Sox. I mean, if you're a Yankee fan, you just count on that guy being disinterested, truly disinterested, meaning impartial. He's going to be objective. He's going to rise above his upbringing and his he may have been a Red Sox fan when he was a kid, but he's got to be disinterested. That's what they meant by disinterested. And I think our whole sports world would collapse if we didn't have. There was that NBA scandal where a referee was seemed to be biased. That's serious. But that gives you an idea of what they meant by disinterestedness. They had an obligation, these people, these gentry, to serve the public. And it was required of them because of their leisure. They didn't have to work, or at least not work with their hands, their independence, and their social and moral preeminence. Now, as aspiring gentlemen, the leaders of this generation shared these assumptions about work, about politeness, and about civilization. Indeed, they were primed, I think, to receive all these new enlightened ideas about civility and gentility. And they were more receptive, more primed to receive them than the English were back home in the old country. It had a particular appeal for these North Americans, as it did for the Scots, the other people on the fringes of this greater British world, the outlying, underdeveloped provinces of this of Scotland and North America. Both. And think of the difference. Think of the comparisons between the Scots and the North Americans. Both were provincial peoples living on the edges of this metropolitan English world. Both lacked the presence of the great hereditary noble families that were at the ruling center of English public life. The Scottish nobles, once the Act of Union of 1707, which created Great Britain. I mean, England and Scotland were two separate nations with a common king, but then they merged in 1707 and became Great Britain, and the Scottish nobles went down to London where the action was, and they were going to be part of the House of Lords. So they left the Edinburgh and Glasgow in the command of minor gentry, professional people. There were no great noblemen left. And the same, of course, was true in North America. In both areas, unlike metropolitan England, the uppermost levels were dominated by this minor gentry. Professional men, relatively small landowners, who were anxious to have their status determined less by their ancestry or the size of their estates and more by their behavior or by their learning. So that's one element that I think links our founders with the Scots. Both the Scots and the North Americans, moreover, were acutely aware of the contrast between civilization and the nearby barbarism that was near them. The Highland tribes, the Highland Scots, were regarded by the people who lived in Glasgow or Edinburgh lowlands as being akin to our Indians. They were savages. And so there's an acute consciousness of what civilization was and how fragile it was and how close it was to barbarism. And the same thing, of course, was true of the North Americans. They were acutely aware of the Indians, or in many cases they called them the savages, that were on their borders. And it gave them a heightened sense of the value, if you will, of civility, of civilization. And both these peoples, North Americans and the Scots, were keenly aware of the degrees of civilization and spent a lot of time writing and reading essays on the stages of social development, from rudeness to refinement. In fact, the Scottish social scientists, who really are the founders of modern social science. I'm thinking of Adam Smith and David Hume and Adam Ferguson and a whole John Millar. They create modern social science. They created this four-stage theory. They're the ones who came up with this notion that we somehow take for granted nowadays. They knew that both peoples knew they lived in a cruder and more simple society than the English, and that England was well along in the fourth and final stage of commercial development, and had much to offer them in the ways of politeness and refinement. Yet at the same time, both the Scots and the North Americans knew only too well that the polite and sophisticated metropolitan center of the empire was steeped in luxury and corruption. England had sprawling, poverty-ridden cities, over-refined manners, gross inequalities of rank, complex divisions of labor, and widespread manufacturing of luxuries, all symptoms of over-advanced social development and social decay. England, in other words, in the minds of the North Americans and in the minds of the Scots, was on the verge of social dissolution. They had developed over-refinement and were about to fall apart. They drew their lessons from Rome in this. So provincials in Scotland and North America began to feel an acute ambivalence about being part of this British Empire. On one hand, they were proud of their simple native provinces, proud of being a citizen of Massachusetts or of Virginia, but keenly aware of the metropolitan center of civilization that was London. So both the Americans and the Scots, in other words, had the unsettling sense that they were living in two cultures simultaneously. Now, although this experience, I think, is unsettling, it's also, I think, creative, stimulating and creative. It's the creativity of a provincial. And I would use as an example or analogy that might make this point clearer, if you think about American novelists in the 20th century. Go back to the beginning of the 20th century. Where's the first group of novelists? They're from the Midwest. People like Theodore Dreiser, Sherwood Anderson, Sinclair Lewis, come out of Chicago or Minnesota. They have an acute consciousness of the Midwestness, of being a member of the Midwest, but they also know that the center of civilization is not the Midwest, it's New York or London. And as a consequence, they have this acute sense of living in two worlds simultaneously. But you can then go through other groups of novelists, the Southerners, Southern novelists. Why should the Southerners be so creative in fiction writing? Faulkner and Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, a whole group of them. It's because I think they live they lived in, and they still, to some extent, still live in two cultures simultaneously. They're acutely conscious of being Southern, but they also know that there's a national culture or an international culture. And it's the juxtaposition of these two cultures. They're unsettled, but they're also a sense of, it also is a stimulus to creativity. It's true of Jews as well. Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Malamud, growing up Jewish, acutely conscious of being Jews, of having a Jewish culture, but also aware of a non-Jewish culture that they are related to. There's a sense of simultaneously experiencing two worlds, and I think it's stimulating. It can be disturbing, but it's also a stimulus to creativity. And you can think of black writers as well. James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, the same thing. They have acute consciousness of being black and black culture, but aware of a white culture that's beyond and beyond their more provincial black culture. It's stimulating. And then think too of the Irish, who always lived on the edges of the British world. Where do you think that? I don't think there's anything in the genes that makes the Irish so creative in writing. Going back to Jonathan Swift all the way up to James Joyce and present-day writers. It has to do with that sense. They're writing in many cases in English, but knowing they're Irish, dealing with a English world that's just a few miles away. That simultaneous experience of two cultures is a source, I think, of creativity. I don't think the Irish had it in their genes. To have it in their genes, it's in their peculiar circumstances. And then I would apply that to these North Americans and the Scots, that they were living in two worlds simultaneously, and it was stimulating, disturbing, but creative. And it accounts for their both areas being so creative at the end of the 18th century. I mentioned some of these Scots: David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson. They matched, if they didn't exceed, the creativity and the brilliance of our founders. Living so close to what they regarded as savagery and barbarism, both the Scottish and North American leaders felt compelled to think freshly about the meaning of being civilized, and in the process they put a heightened emphasis on learned and acquired values at the expense of the traditional inherited values of blood and kinship. And they enthusiastically adopt, as Jane Austen did, these new enlightened 18th century ideals of gentility. They were preoccupied with their honor or their reputation, or in other words, the way they were represented and viewed by others. These revolutionary leaders inevitably became characters, became self-fashioned performers, if you will, in the theater of life. Now, theirs was not character as we today are apt to understand it, as the inner personality that contains hidden contradictions and flaws. Instead, their idea of character was the outer life, the public person, trying to show the world that person was living up to the values and duties that the best of the culture imposed on him. Now, I remember a couple of years ago, it was in May of 2006, when General Hayden was he was up for to be heading the CIA, and the senators were all questioning him: is he qualified to be head of the CIA? He's a general. He's raised in the military tradition. He was asked, "How can we trust you?" This was a senate's question. The reason I got fascinated by this is because both the New York Times and the Washington Post, which I happened to be reading that day simultaneously, both focused in on this little exchange between the senators and General Hayden. They said, "How can we trust you at the CIA?" And this is Hayden's answer: "Well, Senator, you're just going to have to make a judgment on my character." Now that struck, I think, these reporters as a strange new statement to be made, as if someone would even use the term character in that way. I think military still retains some of that older sense. And it came out in this form, and I think it puzzled and kind of filled the reporters with a certain amount of awe. So these revolutionary leaders of ours committed themselves to behaving in a certain moral, virtuous, and civilized manner. Indeed, the intense self-conscious seriousness with which they made that commitment was what ultimately separates them from later generations of American leaders. But that commitment also sets them sharply apart from the older world of their fathers and grandfathers. They were men of high ambition, yet of relatively modest origins. And that combination, I think, made achieved rather than ascribed status important to them. Almost to a man, every single one of them was a first generation in his family to go to college. And several of them, of course, Washington and Franklin, never went to college. But those who did were the first in their families to do so. And if you could think of one whose father wasn't, let me know. Almost all of them, including the second and third ranks of leadership, were the first generation gentlemen. That is to say, the first in their families to attend college and acquire this liberal arts education. Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, was a wealthy Virginia planter and a surveyor who married successfully into the prestigious Randolph family, a really FFV. But Peter Jefferson was not a refined and liberally educated gentleman. He made a lot of money, but he was not a refined gentleman. He did not read Latin. He did not know French. He did not play the violin. And as far as we know, he never once questioned the idea of a religious establishment or the owning of slaves. Now, his son, Thomas Jefferson, raised in the same world, was very different. Indeed, all these revolutionaries knew things that their fathers had not known, and they were eager to prove themselves by what they believed and valued, by their virtue, by their disinterestedness. Now, there's one prominent exception, one prominent revolutionary leader who didn't seek to play the role that the others did, and that is Aaron Burr, who is the exception that proves the rule. Burr, on the face of it, had all the credentials for being a great founder. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, a Princeton graduate, and a charming and wealthy aristocrat. He eventually became a senator from New York and vice president of the United States at a time when you had to be somebody to be vice president. But something set his character off from his colleagues. He inherited his claim to leadership. John Adams said that he had never known in any country the prejudice in favor of birth, parentage, and descent more conspicuous than in the instance of Colonel Burr. Burr was the son of a president of Princeton and the grandson of another president of Princeton, none other than Jonathan Edwards, the great 18th century theologian. Burr, said Adams, was connected by blood with many respectable families in New England. Unlike the other leaders of the generation, unlike Jefferson, Washington, Adams, Hamilton, Madison, Franklin, Burr was born fully and unquestionably into whatever nobility and gentility 18th century America had. Unlike the other revolutionary leaders, Burr never felt that he had to earn his aristocratic status. It was in his blood, and he just assumed it. He never talked about virtue. He didn't need to talk about virtue because he had no explanation. He didn't need to explain why he was a leader. People said the only virtue he has was he never claimed any. And it was what really set him off and I think in the end brought him down. He behaved very differently from the other leaders, especially in promoting his own selfish interests at the expense of the public good. You know the famous story where he gets the Manhattan Water Company gets a bill through the legislature in New York, which sounded good. He's going to supply water to the city of Manhattan, but buried in the thing in the bill was the right to create a bank, which would have been, if people were aware of it, would have been very, very competitive and would have they might not have passed the bill. But that became, of course, we've inherited it. It's the Chase Manhattan Bank. But that's the kind of shenanigans he got involved in. And in the end, he was brought down by both ends of the political spectrum, by Jefferson on the left, so to speak, and Hamilton on the right, who hated each other, but they feared Burr more because Burr lacked what they called character. And they brought him down together in the end. And he's the exception that proves the rule. But the very high-mindedness of these mainstream revolutionary leaders raises fundamental questions. If it was the intense commitment of this generation of founders to these new enlightened values that separates this generation from other generations, why, it might be asked, and has been asked by recent critical historians, did these so-called enlightened and liberally educated gentlemen not do more to reform their society? Why did they fail to enhance the status of women, eliminate slavery entirely, treat the Indians in a more humane manner? And those are the kinds of questions that, of course, your students will ask and historians have been asking over the last 30 years or so. Now, it's true that the founders did not accomplish all that many of them wanted. It turned out that they did not control their society and culture as much as they thought they did. And they were no more able accurately to predict their future than we can predict our future. In the end, many of their enlightened hopes and their kind of elitist leadership were done in by the very democratic and egalitarian forces that they themselves had created. Now, no doubt all of the founders assumed instinctively that the Western territories would eventually belong to the American settlers. But many of them were at the same time scrupulously concerned for the fate of the Indians who occupied these territories. Indeed, the statements of Washington and Henry Knox, who was his Secretary of War in Washington's administration, their statements in the 1790s, even a modern sensitive anthropologist would agree with. Knox especially was concerned about not destroying Indian culture. However, they never doubted that the Indians would have to give up their hunting and gathering stage of culture and move to an agricultural stage. They couldn't occupy all that land. They had to move into a more advanced stage, agricultural stage. And of course, that's how each society moves from one society to another, through demographic growth. The hunter and gathering moved to farming because they ran out of land. They had to farm. They couldn't maintain the huge amounts of hundreds of thousands of acres that would be required for hunting and gathering. So they never doubted that the Indians would have to become farmers, but they wanted at the same time to preserve their culture. Well, the two didn't go together. And they tried to, at least from Philadelphia, or from the capital, tried to protect them. But of course, out on the frontier, on the ground, so to speak, the white settlers had different ideas, and it was a disaster, a tragedy, which we're paying for by creating all these gambling casinos. That's the consequence of what happened. Democracy and demography did the same for the other hopes and plans of the founders. All of the prominent leaders thought that the liberal principles of the revolution would eventually destroy the institution of slavery. There's not a single one of them that I know of that doesn't say slavery is doomed. It has to be. It's incompatible. It's inconsistent with liberty, with the ideals of our revolution. When even Southerners like Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and Henry Lawrence publicly deplored the injustice of slavery, from that moment, declared the New York physician and abolitionist E.H. Smith in 1798. From that moment, he said, the slow but certain death wound was inflicted upon it. Of course, such predictions could not have been more wrong. Far from being doomed, slavery in the United States in the 1790s was on the verge of its greatest expansion. They didn't know that. They really thought it was going to be destroyed. They thought that the ending of the slave trade in 1808 would kill it off. They had no idea that the slaves were demographically reproducing in America at the same rate as the whites, which was the fastest rate of demographic growth of any people in the Western world. We were doubling about every 20 years. And so they simply were blind to that reality. Such self-deception, such mistaken optimism was understandable, they wanted to believe the best. And initially, there was evidence that slavery was dying out. The northern states, where slavery was not inconsequential, 14% of New York was enslaved. 7% of my state, Rhode Island, had slaves. Many of them concentrated in the South County. Kingston, Rhode Island, had 33% of its population enslaved. So, and yet all of these northern states were busy during this period doing away with slavery. And by 1804, all of the northern states, north of the Mason-Dixon line, had set slavery on the road to extinction. And they thought the same thing might happen in the South, particularly the Upper South. Virginia, of course, is the crucial state. You forget that Virginia was almost the whole nation. at the time of that we're talking about. It made up a fifth of the population, 20% of the population. It dominated in territory. It was the richest, biggest, and it had the greatest claims to the West of any of the states. And how Virginia went, the nation would go. It's not surprising that 4 out of the 5 first presidents were Virginians. Virginia was the nation. And the Upper South seemed to be on the way to manumitting its slaves. They were eager for the international trade, ending of the international slave trade. And they, of course, little did people know, but the Virginians were producing more slaves than they could use. But the South, the Upper South, had more abolitionist societies, more anti-slave societies than even the North. They took the slavery off the table in 1790 because they thought the future was going to be different from what it was. As Oliver Ellsworth, who was the 3rd Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, declared, as population increases, poor laborers will be so plenty as to render slaves useless. Slavery in time will not be a speck on our country. They simply misunderstood the future and misunderstood the demographic changes. Whatever the revolutionaries might want, these leaders might want, ordinary white settlers wanted more slaves. And as they did, they wanted the Indians' land as well. So it's ordinary people who were creating the problem, not the leaders who had very different ideas. So if we want to know why we can never again replicate this extraordinary generation of founders, there's a very simple answer. The growth of what we today presumably value most about our society and culture, egalitarian democracy. In the early 19th century, the voices of ordinary people, at least ordinary white people, began to be heard as never before in history. It's first here in the United States that ordinary people come to express themselves, not just in voting, but just in every other way. And they soon overwhelmed the high-minded desires and aims of the revolutionary leaders who had brought them into being. The founders had succeeded only too well in promoting democracy and equality among ordinary people. Indeed, they succeeded in preventing any duplication of themselves. Thank you. Thank you very much.